and welcome to Standard Deviant School, American Government. I'm Christiana Knight. Today's program, the U.S. Constitution. Yep, that 200-plus-year-old document that spells out how the United States is to be governed. Let's get to it.
Here's what we'll cover. First, we'll give you a brief definition of the Constitution and talk about the basic principles of this document. Next, we'll go over the Constitution's 7 articles, what each contains, and finally, we'll wrap up with the Bill of Rights.
The United States Constitution is neighbor to the Declaration of Independence here in the National Archives. A constitution works like an owner's manual for a government. It's a document or set of documents in which the laws or principles of a government, state, or society are laid out. On our tour of the Constitution, we'll start with the basic principles of the Constitution, look at the articles it contains, and see then how the heck it got ratified or approved by the states.
One of the main questions facing the Founding Fathers was what type of government to set up. They had just had a bad experience with the Confederacy, which concentrated power in the states with a weak central government, and they were still smarting from the unfairness of the unitary system they had dealt with in England. What the Founding Fathers came up with was a system of government called federalism, which is sort of a combination of the two. Federalism calls for a strong national government, but still leaves some power in the hands of individual states.
And so the states were bound together under a strong national government, but still had some specific powers reserved just for them. Including, but not limited to, choosing their own license plate slogans.
The framers of the Constitution created a stronger national government than had been done with the Articles of Confederation. At the same time, they protected the interests of the states. A big concern the framers had was of putting way too much power in the hands of one individual or one branch of the government. To address this concern, they decided to separate the powers. Separation of powers divides government power between 3 federal branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The Constitution guarantees that each branch is interdependent upon the other branches via checks and balances. This system of checks and balances gives each branch of government a little bit of control over the others, which allows them to check up on each other. That way, one branch is not allowed to monopolize power.
But there's one more concept to rope into this here caravan of constitutional principles, and that's the Supremacy Clause.
The Supremacy Clause lets everyone know who's in charge. The Supremacy Clause holds that the laws of the Constitution and the nation as a whole are supreme in regard to the laws enacted by each state.
The Supremacy Clause means that any legitimate use of power by the federal government takes precedence over any conflicting actions on the state level. For example, if the federal government's judicial branch finds a law in a state unjust and ridiculous,
the state of Maine outlaws the consumption of any food other than lobster and saltwater taffy.
the state has to nix that law. That's because the judicial branch is responsible for enforcing and interpreting laws through a court system. So, on the legal highway, federal laws have the right of way.
The Constitution of the United States contains 7 articles, and by articles we don't mean Air Force builds bomber or tragedy strikes local rodeo. Article is just a fancy word for section. We'll concentrate more heavily on the first 3 articles because they set up the 3 branches of our government.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch of the American government. In other words, it created Congress.
Congress is what's called a bicameral legislature. A bicameral legislature is divided into 2 parts. In this case, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The legislature is responsible for making and passing laws.
England's Parliament, with its House of Commons and House of Lords, is another example of a bicameral legislature.
Article 1 gives us the nuts and bolts of the Congress, like who's qualified to serve in the Senate and the House, the length of their terms, how senators and representatives are selected, and how we know the number of reps each state is entitled to.
Another key to the first article is the list of enumerated powers. This list contains 17 powers that the framers really wanted Congress to have. Sadly, the members of Congress didn't get the powers they really wanted, like super strength and X-ray vision, and had to settle for enumerated powers, like the powers to tax, coin money, regulate commerce, and provide for the national defense.
The framers also threw in the Necessary and Proper Clause, also called the Elastic Clause. This clause is the mother of elastic powers. The elastic powers set forth by the Elastic Clause grant Congress with the authority to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out the 17 enumerated powers. So, elastic powers stretch Congress's enumerated powers.
The next article, Article 2, establishes another branch of government, the executive branch. It's called that because it has the power to execute the laws of the nation. And who has the power to execute the laws around this here land? The biggest Mac Daddy of them all. The head honcho, the top dog, the big cheese, El Presidente, the President of the United States.
Article 2 spells out the president's term of office and describes the necessary qualifications for the presidential office. It describes what the job actually is and spells out the rules for replacing the president should the president get kicked out of office or die.
Article 3 sets forth the description and structure of the judicial branch. For without Article 3, we would have no judicial branch. And without the judicial branch, we would have no Supreme Court. And if we didn't have the Supreme Court, law and order would become a thing of the past, and we'd all be forced into little cells and listen to nothing but Bananarama songs.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution establishes the judicial branch of our government. We also call this the federal court system, which includes the Supreme Court. Article 3 also defines the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. The Supreme Court was given the authority and jurisdiction to decide all cases that were considered on the federal level. This includes cases between states or between a state and federal government.
The creation of this judicial system worried some. You see, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, so they have the final say on lots of important issues. With this in mind, the Congress also set up inferior courts, federal courts lower than the Supreme Court. But even with these small court systems operating, the country still recognized the Supreme Court as an extremely influential part of the judicial system.
After those first three articles, this fourth one is going to seem kind of boring.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the states and the federal government and explains how new states are admitted to the Union. It also guarantees to every state a Republican form of government. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution.
Amendment is a change. Now, the framers didn't want to make it too easy to change the Constitution. I mean, after all, anything too easy to change wouldn't hold much water. That's why they went with a two-stage amendment process.
The two stages of the Constitution's amendment process are proposal and ratification. Proposals are like, hey, why don't we make such and such a change to the Constitution? Ratification is like, hey, that's a great idea, let's go ahead and make that change. Each stage can occur in two different ways. Let's start with the proposal process. Amendments to the Constitution can be proposed two ways. First, there can be a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. Or second, 2/3 of the state legislatures can vote to have Congress call for a National Amendment Proposal Convention.
That second proposal method has never been used, but it's nice to have around because it can be pulled out to whip Congress into action should they not take it upon themselves to propose a constitutional change.
The second half of the two-stage amendment process is ratification. There are two ways ratification occurs. Both ways rest squarely on the shoulders of the states.
The first way constitutional amendments are ratified or approved is by a favorable vote in 3/4 of all state legislatures. The second way is for each state to call a special ratifying convention. If 3/4 of all these state conventions vote in favor of the amendment, then the amendment is in.
It's important to remember that in the 200-year history of the United States, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times, which tells you how good a job the Founding Fathers did when they wrote this stuff in the first place.
Of all the amendments, only one has been repealed or overturned.
Things were looking up. Legal beer was back.
The 18th Amendment, which outlawed the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages, was ratified in 1919. After a few years, the country decided that prohibition just didn't work.
Beer was back after 13 years, a long time between drinks.
But the only way to repeal an amendment to the Constitution is with another amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment, which made alcohol legal again, was ratified in 1933. So now we have two amendments that just cancel each other out.
And now it's time for Article 6. Article 6 contains that supremacy clause we told you about earlier and explains how the laws of the United States are the supreme laws of the land. Article 6 also states that no religious test will be required in order to hold an office.
Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for how to ratify the Constitution. Ratification is when the document first becomes legal and binding. A vote of 9 of the original 13 colonies is all it took to put ratification into action.
So that's the meat of the Constitution for you. Before we go further, let's take a quick look at the articles we just covered.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch and creates Congress, a bicameral legislature. That means it has 2 houses. Article 2 establishes the executive branch and spells out the duties of the president. And Article 3 establishes the judicial branch and defines the Supreme Court's jurisdiction.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the state and federal governments. And Article 5 tells us how to change the Constitution. Article 6 states the Supremacy Clause and explains how the federal government gets the final say in most arguments about laws. Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for ratifying the Constitution.
Once the Constitution was penned, ratification was not automatic. The colonies quickly divided into 2 separate factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong national government, the growth of industry, and they supported the newly written Constitution.
But the Anti-Federalists preferred stronger state governments, a weaker national government, the continuance of an agrarian economy instead of an industrial economy, and they really weren't big fans of the Constitution.
Not too hard to decode, right? The Federalists wanted a strong federal government, the Anti-Federalists didn't. It was the same argument. In general, the Federalists were made up of merchants from the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and people who owned a lot of land. If you needed a word to describe the Federalists, you'd probably call them elitist.
The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were small farmers, shopkeepers, and working Joes. They believed in the good of the common man and were in favor of a more participatory democracy. In other words, they wanted the government to be more accountable to the people, and they wanted to see more protections of individual rights, something they feared a strong national government couldn't give them.
Unfortunately for the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists brought out the big guns. James the Mad Dog Madison, Alexander the Ham Hamilton, and John Jam Jay. And these big guns proceeded to write some documents called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 political papers that explained the rationale behind the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists volleyed back with a series of letters that attempted a line-by-line critique of the Constitution.
Unfortunately for the Anti-Federalists, 2 of the 3 guys who wrote the Federalist Papers wound up on dollar bills. Now, when was the last time you heard about an Anti-Federalist?
After a feud that would make Shakespeare proud, even though he is English, the Federalists triumphed, and the Constitution was eventually ratified by a final vote by the states, though the Anti-Federalists didn't go home entirely unhappy.
One of the main goals of the Anti-Federalists was to protect personal liberties. They still felt the wounds that England had inflicted on their personal liberties, such as the right to a fair trial. The Anti-Federalists convinced almost everyone else that personal liberties were a good idea. And so, before the Constitution could be ratified, the Bill of Rights was written and became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
Here's a quick rundown of the amendments that make up the Bill of Rights.
The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, press, and assembly.
The Second Amendment gives citizens the right to bear arms.
The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of troops in private homes.
The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizures.
The Fifth Amendment protects the rights of people accused of a crime. It guarantees due process of law, requires an indictment by a grand jury, prohibits a person from being tried for the same crime twice, and gives the defendants in a trial the right not to testify against themselves. The Sixth Amendment continues the rights of people accused of a crime, promising a speedy and public trial before an impartial jury, the right to an attorney, and the right to cross-examine witnesses.
The Seventh Amendment preserves the right to a trial by a jury in a civil suit.
The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment.
The Ninth Amendment states that just because a right is not listed in the Constitution, that doesn't mean the people do not have that right. So all rights not expressly written in the Constitution belong to the people.
The 10th Amendment was designed to make the states happy. It says that any rights that aren't denied to the people or states or specifically given to the federal government are retained by the states or the people. This amendment was added to appease anti-federalists who thought the